The central task of this lecture is to examine the catastrophic victory of fascism in Germany in 1933, the role of the Stalinist Comintern and the Social Democratic Party, SPD, in enabling Hitler's seizure of power, and how these events compelled Leon Trotsky to draw the conclusion that it was necessary to build a new Fourth International. This was not a subjective response to defeat, but an objective political reorientation grounded in Marxist analysis. Trotsky's writings from the first half of the 1930s represent some of the most profound contributions to revolutionary strategy in the 20th century. They are inseparable from the historical experience of the German working class, which, despite its strength, traditions, and revolutionary determination, was betrayed by its leaderships. The crisis of capitalism that emerged after World War I had its sharpest expression in Germany. The Weimar Republic, born from the defeat of the German Revolution of 1918-1919, was politically unstable and economically volatile. The burden of war, reparations, hyperinflation in 1923, and the crash of 1929 had devastated broad layers of the population and radicalized the working class. Germany was the linchpin of the European class struggle. As Trotsky emphasized in his famous article, Germany, the Key to the International Situation, written from his exile in Prinkipo, Turkey in November 1931, and I quote, "On this hardly peaceful political background of the world, the situation in Germany stands out sharply. The economic and political contradictions have there reached unprecedented acuteness. The solution is approaching. The moment has come when the pre-revolutionary situation must be transformed into the revolutionary or the counter-revolutionary. On the direction in which the solution of the German crisis develops will depend not only the fate of Germany herself, and that is already a great deal, but also the fate of Europe, the destiny of the entire world, for many years to come. Socialist construction in the USSR, the course of the Spanish Revolution, the development of the pre-revolutionary situation in England, the future of French imperialism, the fate of the revolutionary movement in China and India, all this directly and immediately rests upon the question of who will be victorious in Germany in the course of the next few months, communism or fascism." End of quote. Germany had the largest organized working class in the world. The Social Democratic Party, SPD, and the Communist Party, KPD, together commanded millions of votes and members. The SPD had led the workers' movement for decades, while the KPD had emerged from the November Revolution in 1918 and the betrayal of 1914, when the SPD supported the war credits of the Kaiser. Yet this powerful movement was paralyzed in the face of the fascist danger. Despite the economic crisis and rise of far-right violence, the German proletariat remained a formidable force. In the last relatively free elections of November 1932, the SPD and KPD together received 13.2 million votes, 37.3%, compared to the NSDAP's 11.7 million votes. That's 33.1%. On paper, the workers' movement still had the upper hand, but the political disunity and misleadership proved decisive. The SPD clung to a rigid legalism, defending the decaying Weimar institutions. Its leaders feared revolution more than fascism. The KPD, subordinated to the Stalinized Comintern, denounced the SPD as social fascists and refused any struggle to unify rank-and-file workers loyal to the SPD and to the KPD in a struggle against the Nazi danger. Even as Hitler's stormtroopers terrorized workers in the streets, the KPD advanced the line that the main enemy was the SPD, not the Nazis. Trotsky, advocating the policy of the United Front, insisted that only joint action by the SPD and KPD could stop fascism. In his article for Workers' United Front Against Fascism in December 1931, he elaborated, the strategy. Quote, "No common platform with the social democracy or with the leaders of the German trade unions. No common publications, banners, placards. March separately, but strike together. Agree only on how to strike, whom to strike, and when to strike. Such an agreement can be concluded even with the devil himself, with his grandmother, and even with Noske and Krasinsky. On one condition, not to bind one's hands. It is necessary, without any delay, finally to elaborate a practical system of measures, not with the aim of merely exposing the social democracy before the communists, but with the aim of actual struggle against fascism. The question of factory defense organizations, of unhampered activity on the part of the factory councils, the inviolability of the workers' organizations and institutions, the question of arsenals that may be seized by the fascists, the question of measures in the case of an emergency, that is, of the coordination of the actions of the communist and the social democratic divisions in the struggle, etc., etc., must be dealt with in this program. In the struggle against fascism, the factory councils occupy a tremendously important position. Here, a particularly precise program of action is necessary. Every factory must become an anti-fascist bulwark, with its own commandants and its own battalions. It is necessary to have a map of the fascist barracks and all other fascist strongholds in every city, in every district. The fascists are attempting to encircle the revolutionary strongholds. The encirclers must be encircled. On this basis, an agreement with the social democratic and trade union organizations is not only permissible, but a duty. To reject this for reasons of principle, in reality because of bureaucratic stupidity, or what is still worse, because of cowardice, is to give direct and immediate aid to fascism." End of quote. While the KPD developed the complacent slogan "After Hitler us," suggesting to communist workers that Hitler would be unable to remain in power for long and that the socialist revolution would soon follow the rapid collapse of the Nazi regime, Trotsky stressed tirelessly that unless the working class took action, the road to dictatorship and the crushing of all working class organizations was open. He wrote, quote, "At the moment that the normal police and military resources of the bourgeois dictatorship, together with their parliamentary screens, no longer suffice to hold society in a state of equilibrium, the turn of the fascist regime arrives." End of quote. And he explained the character of a fascist state. When a state turns fascist, it doesn't only mean that the forms and methods of government are changed in accordance with the patterns set by Mussolini. The changes in this sphere ultimately play a minor role, but it means, first of all, for the most part, that the workers' organizations are annihilated, that the proletariat is reduced to an amorphous state, and that a system of administration is created which penetrates deeply into the masses and which serves to frustrate the independent crystallization of the proletariat. Therein, precisely, is the gist of fascism. End of quote. The political degeneration of the KPD, which was founded on January 1st, 1919, still under the leadership of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, was a direct consequence of the Stalinist transformation of the German Communist Party and the Communist International as a whole. After the missed revolution of 1923, Trotsky was attacked as a right-winger within the KPD because he refused to make then party leader Heinrich Brandler, who had called off the planned insurrection in the last minute, solely responsible for the October defeat. Brandler was replaced by Ruth Fischer and Arkady Maslov, leaders of the KPD's left wing and allies of Communist International Chairman Gregory Zinoviev, who suppressed the documents of the left opposition. Only when Zinoviev broke with Stalin and aligned himself with Trotsky did a fierce factional struggle erupt within the KPD. But as a consequence, and following orders from Moscow, Fischer and Maslov were removed and expelled from the party. The place was taken by Ernst Thälmann, who became a loyal servant of Stalin and implemented the increasingly catastrophic political line of the Stalinized Communist International in Germany. In 1928, the Comintern adopted the theory of social fascism, asserting that social democracy was the twin of fascism. This led to a disastrous ultra-left policy, severing all ties with the SPD rank and file. At the center of the KPD's line was its rejection to see any difference between social democracy and fascism. Because both supported the capitalist order, the KPD adopted the position that essentially no distinction should be made between the two. Trotsky attacked this position sharply. He wrote, quote, "It is absolutely correct to place on the Social Democrats the responsibility for the emergency legislation of pruning, as well as for the impending danger of fascist savagery. It is absolute balderdash to identify social democracy with fascism." He wrote in What Next? And he added, "The social democracy, which is today the chief representative of the parliamentary bourgeois regime, derives its support from the workers. Fascism is supported by the petty bourgeoisie. The social democracy, without the mass organizations of the workers, can have no influence. Fascism cannot entrench itself in power without annihilating the workers' organizations. Parliament is the main arena of the social democracy. The system of fascism is based upon the destruction of parliamentarism. For the monopolistic bourgeoisie, the parliamentary and fascist regimes represent only different vehicles of dominion. It has recourse to one or the other, depending upon the historical conditions. But for both, the social democracy and fascism, the choice of one or the other vehicle has an independent significance. More than that, for them, it's a question of political life or death." End of quote. This difference had to be exploited. In the article For a Workers' United Front Against Fascism, from which I already quoted, Trotsky explained, "The thousands upon thousands of Noskes, Welses, and Hilferdings, leaders of the SPD, prefer, in the last analysis, fascism to communism. But for that, they must once and for all tear themselves loose from the workers. Today, this is not yet the case. Today, the social democracy as a whole, with all its internal antagonisms, is forced into sharp conflict with the fascists. It is our task to take advantage of this conflict and not to unite the antagonists against us. The front must now be directed against fascism. And this common front of direct struggle against fascism, embracing all the entire proletariat, must be utilized in the struggle against the social democracy, directed as a flank attack, but no less effective for all that." End of quote. By opposing a united front and instead delivering ultimatums to the Social Democrats, and in some cases even collaborating with the Nazis against the SPD, most infamously, the KPD joined the Nazis in backing the 1931 referendum to oust the SPD-led government in Prussia. The Stalinists kept the social democratic workers, who were increasingly coming into opposition to the leadership, tied to it. Thälmann infamously promoted in his speeches a People's Revolution, which Trotsky took up sharply. Quote, "Every issue of the paper of the fascist Strasser is embellished with the slogan of the People's Revolution, as opposed to the Marxist slogan of the class revolution. It is understood that every great revolution is a people's or a national revolution, in the sense that it unites around the revolutionary class all the virile and creative forces of the nation and reconstructs the nation around a new core. But this is not a slogan. It is a sociological description of the revolution, which requires, moreover, precise and concrete definition. As a slogan, it is inane and charlatanism, market competition with the fascists, paid for at the price of injecting confusion into the minds of the workers." End of quote. This confusion, spread by the KPD leadership, paralyzed the working class demoralized the membership of the KPD itself, and played into the hand of the fascists, who were able to exploit the mass impoverishment of broad layers of the middle class caused by the Great Depression. Trotsky correctly stressed that the turn of the radicalized petty bourgeoisie into the camp of fascism was not a necessary process. Had the KPD really fought the Nazis with a correct and determined strategy, many of them would have supported a communist revolution. In his crucial pamphlet, Germany, the Only Road, Trotsky explained the political mechanism that pushed large sections of the petty bourgeoisie towards fascism. He wrote, quote, "It is quite capable of linking its fate with that of the proletariat." Trotsky speaking about the petty bourgeoisie. For that, only one thing is needed. The petty bourgeoisie must acquire faith in the ability of the proletariat to lead society into a new road. The proletariat can inspire this faith only by its strength, by the firmness of its actions, by a skillful offensive against the enemy, by the success of its revolutionary policy. And he continued, "But if the Revolutionary Party, in spite of a class struggle becoming incessantly more accentuated, proves time and time again to be incapable of uniting the working class behind it, if it vacillates, becomes confused, contradicts itself, then the petty bourgeoisie loses patience and begins to look upon the revolutionary workers as those responsible for its own misery." All the bourgeois parties, including the social democracy, turn its thoughts in this very direction. When the social crisis takes on an intolerable acuteness, a particular party appears on the scene with the direct aim of agitating the petty bourgeoisie to a white heat, and of directing its hatred and its despair against the proletariat. In Germany, this historic function is fulfilled by National Socialism, a broad current whose ideology is composed of all the putrid vapors and decomposing bourgeois society. While Trotsky stressed that the principal political responsibility for the growth of fascism rests, of course, on the shoulders of the social democracy, he also stressed that the political question, however, is not settled for us with the responsibility of the social democracy. He wrote, "Ever since the beginning of the war, we have denounced this party as the agency of the imperialist bourgeoisie within the ranks of the proletariat. Out of this new orientation of the revolutionary Marxists arose the Third International. Its task consisted in uniting the proletariat under the banner of the revolution, and thereby securing for it the directing influence over the oppressed masses of the petty bourgeoisie in the towns and the countryside. The post-war period in Germany, more than anywhere else, was an epoch of economic hopelessness and civil war. The international conditions, as well as the domestic ones, pushed the country peremptorily on the road to socialism. Every step of the social democracy revealed its decadence and its impotence, the reactionary import of its politics, the banality of its leaders. What other conditions are needed for the development of the Communist Party? And yet, after the first few years of significant successes, German communism entered into an era of vacillations, zigzags, alternate turns to opportunism and adventurism. The centrist bureaucracy has systematically weakened the proletarian vanguard and prevented it from bringing the class under its leadership. Thus, it has robbed the proletariat as a whole of the possibility of leading behind it the oppressed masses of the petty bourgeoisie. The Stalinist bureaucracy bears the direct and immediate responsibility for the growth of fascism before the proletarian vanguard." End of quote. The failure of the KPD ultimately allowed Hitler to seize power without triggering a civil war. The consequences were catastrophic. Within weeks, the Communist Party, along with all other working class parties and organizations, was banned and destroyed. Tens of thousands of socialists and communists disappeared in concentration camps and were tortured and killed. The German proletariat, long regarded as the best organized in the world, experienced a historic defeat. The KPD's bankrupt political line did not arise from mistaken theory alone. It reflected the fundamental transformation of the Comintern under Stalin. By the early 1930s, the Soviet bureaucracy's primary concern was not world revolution, but national security and diplomatic maneuvering. I would like to take this fundamental question a little bit more directly. Was the KPD's policy simply an error, or did it express a conscious betrayal? In 1923, Trotsky had argued that the Soviet leadership and Comintern, despite their mistakes, which we have already discussed to some extent at the school, genuinely sought revolution. 10 years later, the Stalinist bureaucracy had more and more directly become a force of counter-revolution. In What Next? Trotsky wrote, quote, "The ruling and uncontrolled position of the Soviet bureaucracy is conducive to a psychology which in many ways is directly contradictory to the psychology of a proletarian revolutionist. Its own aims and combinations in domestic as well as international politics are placed by the bureaucracy above the tasks of the revolutionary education of the masses and have no connection with the tasks of international revolution." End of quote. The bureaucracy was used to issuing ultimatums and giving orders. It failed to anticipate developments and responded to the disastrous consequences of its own policies with a volatile zigzag course, swinging between ultra-left and right-wing positions. From 1924 to 1928, the Comintern followed essentially a right-wing orientation that produced catastrophic defeats. During the 1926 British general strike, Stalin instructed the British Communist Party to give uncritical support to the General Council of Trade Unions Congress (TUC) bureaucracy that ultimately betrayed the strike. Between 1925 and 1927 in China, Stalin instructed the Communist Party to support the national bourgeois Kuomintang movement based on the theory of the bloc of four classes in the struggle against imperialism. This policy of class collaboration, an open betrayal of the theory of permanent revolution, left the Chinese working class and much of the Communist Party leadership vulnerable to the brutal massacres carried out by both the Kuomintang and its left wing in Shanghai and Wuhan and other major Chinese cities. In 1928, the Stalinist bureaucracy responded to the agrarian crisis within the Soviet Union caused by Stalin's policy of slow industrialization and his accommodation to the kulaks by veering sharply to the left, an abrupt shift which it then enforced across its sections. This marked the beginning of the so-called Third Period, in which the Stalinist bureaucracy declared at the outset that the struggle for power was immediately on the agenda in every country. The theory of social fascism was a product of this turn. By 1933, Stalin and the bureaucracy viewed international developments through an entirely nationalist lens. They not only underestimated Hitler's threat, what mattered most to them was not the fate of the German workers, but the short-term interests of the Soviet Union as defined by the bureaucracy. The Comintern had become the foreign policy tool of the Kremlin. The German disaster confirmed its transformation into a counter-revolutionary agency. If the Stalinist KPD actively disoriented and divided the working class, the SPD tied it politically to the bourgeoisie and capitalism. The SPD leadership, thoroughly integrated into the Weimar political apparatus, regarded any revolutionary upsurge as a greater threat than fascism itself. Even in the face of mass fascist violence, the SPD insisted on a legalistic and constitutional path, pinning its hopes on the Reichstag and judiciary, and finally even far-right President General Paul von Hindenburg, who played a key role in the conspiracy to hand power to the Nazis. Of course, this essentially counter-revolutionary role did not fall from the sky. Following its historical betrayal of 1914 and its support for German imperialism during World War I, the SPD, in an alliance with right-wing Freikorps, suppressed the revolutionary struggles of the German proletariat in 1918 and 1919, culminating in the murder of Liebknecht and Luxemburg, with a clear aim to preserve the bourgeois order. The result was the Weimar Republic, where the old reactionary forces continued to operate behind a democratic facade. When the global economic crisis shattered the fragile social equilibrium in 1929, the SPD once again saved the Republic, this time by systematically dismantling its democratic framework. Initially, the SPD aligned itself with the Brüning government, which bypassed parliament and ruled through emergency decrees. It then supported the re-election of Hindenburg as Reich president, who would appoint Hitler as chancellor on January 30 in 1933. Rather than mobilizing its base against the growing fascist threat, the SPD placed its hopes in the police, the military, and the Reich president. Even when Hindenburg and Van Papen ousted the Social Democratic-led government in Prussia by force in 1932, the SPD remained passive, choosing instead to file a constitutional complaint with the Supreme Court. Trotsky captured the essence of their stance with biting clarity. Quote, "A mass party leading millions toward socialism holds that the question as to which class will come to power in present-day Germany, which is shaken to its very foundations, depends not on the fighting strength of the German proletariat, not on the shock groups of fascism, not even on the personnel of the Reichswehr, but on whether the pure spirit of the Weimar Constitution, along with the required quantity of camphor and naphthalene, shall be installed in the presidential palace." End of quote. The SPD's submissive posture not only left the working class defenseless, it also emboldened the fascists. As Trotsky sharply noted, the effect which the appeals of the social democracy produce on the state apparatus, on the judges, the Reichswehr, and the police cannot fail to be just the opposite to the one desired. The most loyal functionary, the most neutral, the least bound to the National Socialists, can reason only thus. Millions are behind the Social Democrats. Enormous resources are in their hands. The press, the parliament, the municipalities. Their own heights are at stake. In the struggle against the fascists, they are assured of the support of the communists. And even so, these mighty gentlemen beg me, a functionary, to save them from the attack of another party comprising millions whose leaders may become my bosses tomorrow. Things must be pretty bad for the gentlemen of the social democracy. Probably quite hopeless. It is time for me, the functionary, to think about my own height. And as a result, the loyal, neutral functionary who vacillated yesterday will invariably reinsure himself, i.e. tie up with the National Socialists to safeguard his own future. In this manner, the reformists who have outlived their own day work for the fascists along bureaucratic lines. End of quote. To put it somewhat more bluntly, it would be no exaggeration to suggest that if SPD leaders had been shown the full horrors of Hitler's regime in advance, the concentration camps, book burnings, suppression of all socialist and trade union rights, they would likely have still chosen the path over the danger of revolution. The historical role, as Trotsky had emphasized since 1914, was the preservation of the bourgeois order under any circumstances. But Trotsky always distinguished between the SPD leaders and the workers who followed them. Millions of workers remained loyal to the SPD out of habit, tradition, or lack of an alternative because of the increasingly misguided policies of the KPD. Many workers and intellectuals followed Trotsky's writings and understood the warnings. There was also constant and determined struggle by the left opposition in Germany, challenging both the SPD and the KPD and fighting for a correct political line and a united front against fascism. So I want to turn to the origins of the left opposition in Germany. They can be traced back to the development and conflicts within the Communist Party of Germany over the missed revolution of 1923 and Trotsky's lessons of October and his determined struggle against the increasingly nationalist politics of the Stalinist bureaucracy in the Soviet Union. On September 1st in 1926, 700 prominent members of the KPD publicly declared their support for the Russian United Opposition in an open letter. They rejected the theory of socialism in one country and called for an open discussion of the Russian question within the party. In April 1928, this group went to found the Lenin Bund. Trotsky's followers constituted a minority within the Lenin Bund. The majority, led by Hugo Urbans, were aligned with Zinoviev. In the historical and international foundations of the Sozialistische Gleichheitspartei, we characterize the organization which retained many ultra-left tendencies that Lenin and Trotsky had previously combated within the KPD and the Comintern as follows. It, the Lenin Bund, was inclined to petty bourgeois impatience and unprincipled maneuvers, ranked unimportant squabbles above matters of principle, and decided on international questions on the basis of national criteria. End of quote. By 1929-1930, a decisive break between the Lenin Bund and the left opposition had become unavoidable. After Trotsky publicly criticized the group, his supporters were expelled. The core disagreements revolved around the class nature of the Soviet Union, which Urbans and his followers defined as state capitalist, and the international strategy of the revolutionary movement. In an open letter to the members of the Lenin Bund, Trotsky emphasized that the left opposition could only develop as an international tendency. He wrote, "Those who believe that the international left will someday take shape as a simple sum of national groups, and that therefore the international unification can be postponed indefinitely until the national groups grow strong, attribute only a secondary importance to the international factor, and by this very reason take the path of national opportunism. It is undeniable that each country has greatest peculiarities of its own, but in our epoch, these peculiarities can be essayed and exploited in a revolutionary way only from an internationalist point of view. On the other hand, only an international organization can be the bearer of an international ideology. Can anyone seriously believe that isolated oppositional national groups, divided among themselves and left to their own resources, are capable of finding the correct road by themselves? No, this is a certain path to national degeneration, sectarianism, and ruin. The tasks facing the international opposition are enormously difficult. Only by being indissolubly tied together, only by working out answers jointly to all current problems, only by creating the international platform, only by mutually verifying each one of their steps, that is, only by uniting in a single international body, will the national groups of the opposition be able to carry out their historic task." End of quote. In spring 1930, following their expulsion from the Lenin Bund, Trotsky supporters formed the German left opposition. They launched an energetic struggle to challenge the KPD's political degeneration and to re-establish a revolutionary communist influence in the working class. Despite operating under intense political pressure and material hardship, the new organization faced internal strife inherited from the broader crisis of the communist movement. Bureaucratic methods and factionalism plagued its ranks. Trotsky attempted to intervene through a series of personal letters, and in February 1931 addressed the matter in a letter to all sections of the international left opposition. He traced the group's dysfunction back to the, quote, administrative approach of the epigones, i.e. the Stalinists, in the spheres of the principles, ideas, and the methods of Marxism since 1923. Trotsky noted that the left opposition had to be built, quote, on a foundation which is overcrowded within the remnants and splinters of former breakdowns, end of quote. Trotsky sharply criticized the prevailing clique mentality and warned against toying with principles, journalistic light-mindedness, moral looseness, and pseudo-irreconcilability in the name of personal caprice. And he insisted the crisis could only be resolved through active international assistance. He called for an immediate end to retaliatory expulsions, the formation of a control commission, and the preparation of a party conference under the guidance of the International Secretariat. The internal conflicts of the German left opposition were further exploited by Stalinist GPU agents, most notably the Lithuanian brothers Rubin and Abraham Sobolevicius, who operated under the pseudonyms Roman Well and Adolf Senin. Both were active in the Leipzig group, which clashed with the Berlin faction and were only later exposed as GPU agents. Senin confessed under oath in a US court in the 1950s. The brothers worked as informants and provocateurs, feeding distorted reports to Trotsky and gathering intelligence on his network, including his son Leon Sedov, who was ultimately murdered by the GPU on February 16, 1938 in Paris. As the political crisis in Germany deepened in mid-1932, Lenin and Well openly defected to Stalinism. Just 10 days before Hitler took power, they published a forged issue of the newspaper Permanente Revolution, Permanent Revolution, falsely announcing a split between the German left opposition and Trotsky. Stalinist media, including the Rote Fahne, Red Flag, one of the major papers of the Communist Party, eagerly circulated this fabrication. Trotsky addressed the affair in his 1933 article, Serious Lessons from an Inconsequential Thing. While he already, at that time, suspected signs of GPU involvement, Trotsky focused on the political implications. He concluded that the left opposition must urgently focus on training a new generation of proletarian cadre. What he wrote on that, I believe, also sums up very directly the essence and orientation of this summer school. Quote, the Bolshevik Leninists must seriously pose the question of the training and education of new cadre of the proletarian youth. The left opposition has its own revolutionary conceptions, its own history and tradition. Only on this basis can a serious proletarian revolutionist be educated. Hand in hand with the political struggle, systematic theoretical training must be carried on. The munition must be prepared for a whole historical epoch. End of quote. Despite internal crisis, Stalinist sabotage and state repression, the German left opposition was able to build an active base. It circulated Trotsky's writings, regularly published its own magazine, Permanente Revolution, established local groups in dozens of cities, and gained influence within the factories, showing that its principled program resonated powerfully among layers of the working class. But the crisis of the German workers' movement also gave rise to centrist tendencies, those that vacillated between reform and revolution, clarity and confusion. The most prominent of these was the SAP, Socialist Workers' Party, formed in 1931 as a left split from the SPD. It emerged as a political refuge for diverse currents, that had found no place in either the SPD or the KPD. Left-wing Social Democrats, former USPD leaders, including, for example, Georg Ledebour, remnants of the KAPD, defectors from the Lenin Bund and the KPD, opposition, the Brandlerites, as well as radical pacifists. The SAP criticized the SPD's passivity and the KPD's sectarianism, but it failed to break with reformist methods or orient decisively toward the building of a revolutionary leadership. Trotsky saw in the SAP a political current expressing the pressure of the radicalizing petty bourgeois intelligentsia. He was open to dialogue with the SAP's left wing, but made no concession on program. He wrote, "Reformism gives place to the innumerable shades of centrism, which now, in the majority of countries, dominate the workers' movement." That's from his 2 articles on centrism, published in early 1934. And he continued, "The new international cannot form itself in any other way than that of struggle against centrism. Ideological intransigence and flexible united front policy are, in these conditions, 2 weapons for attaining one and the same end." End of quote. In Centrism and the Fourth International, another very important article on the question of centrism, Trotsky laid out the essential characteristics of centrism. In the field of theory, centrism is impressive and eclectic, avoids theoretical obligations, and inclines, that's a direct quote from this article, in words to give preference to revolutionary practice over theory, without understanding that only Marxist theory can give to practice a revolutionary direction. A centrist views with hatred the revolutionary principle, state that which is, and inclines to substituting in the place of political principles, personal combinations, and petty organizational diplomacy. His shilly-shallying, the centrist frequently covers up by reference to the dangers of sectarianism. But by sectarianism, it understands not a passivity of abstract propaganda, but the anxious care for principle, the clarity of position, political consistency, definedness in organization. And he does not understand that one cannot build in the present period a national revolutionary party save as part of an international party. End of quote. The SAP's inability to act decisively in 1933, when the entire fate of the German and international working class was at stake, proved the political bankruptcy of centrism. It neither led nor clarified, and in the end, its historical role was that of confusion and retreat. Under pressure from the Nazi onslaught, the SAP briefly shifted to the left. Left Social Democrats Max Seidewitz and Kurt Rosenfeld were replaced as party leaders by Jakob Walcher and Paul Fröhlich, founding members of the KPD who had joined the KPD opposition around Brandler. In August 1933, the SAP, alongside the international left opposition and 2 Dutch parties, called for the founding of the Fourth International. In their declaration of 4, the signatories asserted unequivocally, quote, that the new international cannot tolerate any conciliation towards reformism or centrism, and that the new international must not permit any deviation from revolutionary principles in the question of insurrection, proletarian dictatorship, Soviet form of the state, etc. In practice, however, the SAP soon obstructed the building of the Fourth International. In its essay, Trotskyism or Revolutionary Realpolitik, it argued that founding a new international was premature. The vanguard could not leap over stages in the development of proletarian consciousness, it claimed, insisting that, quote, the vanguard is formed not by the proclamation of some correct but abstract principles, but through the permanent participation in the concrete daily struggles of the proletariat. End of quote. This attack was the SAP's response to Trotsky's open letter for the Fourth International, published in spring 1935. I will return to this crucial statement again later. It was addressed to all revolutionary working class organizations and groups and insisted that building new parties and a new international was central to solving the problem of revolutionary leadership and perspective. In response of the skepticism and essentially opportunist arguments of the centrists, Trotsky argued that the impending war danger does not brook a delay in the fight to unify the working class on a world scale under the banner of the Fourth International for even a single day. The Nazi victory in January 1933 marked a critical turning point in the history of the Trotskyist movement, writes David North in Leon Trotsky and the Struggle for Socialism in the 21st Century. Since the founding of the left opposition, Trotsky's political objective had been to bring about the reform of the Russian Communist Party and the Communist International. This was the principal strategy that guided the international left opposition following Trotsky's deportation from the Soviet Union in the first 4 years of his exile in Brekipo. But the defeat in Germany demanded a reconsideration of the international left opposition's policy of reforming the Communist International and its national sections. In the immediate aftermath of Hitler's victory in January 1933, Trotsky had waited. He still hoped that the magnitude of the defeat would provoke a reassessment within the Comintern. But when the Executive Committee of the Communist International in March 1933 reaffirmed the KPD's line and defended its record, Trotsky concluded that the Third International was finished as a revolutionary organization. As Trotsky emphasized, Stalinism, just like social democracy in 1914, had definitely crossed over into the camp of bourgeois counter-revolution. And this required drawing the necessary political conclusions. The idea of reforming the communist parties or the Communist International was no longer viable. As David North explains in Leon Trotsky and the Development of Marxism, that's of course an important series of articles, which is also published in the book I just quoted from. The quantitative accumulation of political betrayals had produced a qualitative transformation of Stalinism itself. It had passed from bureaucratic centrism to conscious counter-revolution. End of quote. Trotsky addressed this decisive change of orientation and the conclusions which had to be drawn from this in his programmatic article to build communist parties and an international anew. He wrote, "The most dangerous thing in politics is to fall captive to one's own formula that yesterday was appropriate, but is bereft of all content today. An organization which was not roused by the thunder of fascism and which submits docilely to such outrageous acts of the bureaucracy demonstrates thereby that it is dead and that nothing can ever revive it. To say this openly and publicly is our direct duty towards the proletariat and its future. In all our subsequent work, it is necessary to take as our point of departure the historical collapse of the official Communist International." End of quote. The call for the Fourth International was not a rhetorical gesture. It arose from the recognition that the Third International, as the Second International in 1914, had irreversibly degenerated. The Seventh World Congress of the Comintern, held in July-August 1935, fully confirmed this assessment. The Comintern had become the diplomatic agency of the Soviet bureaucracy. Under the leadership of Georgy Dimitrov, the Comintern embraced the strategy of the Popular Front, a coalition not only with reformist workers' parties, but also with liberal bourgeois parties. The stated aim was not the seizure of power by the working class, but the defense of bourgeois democracy, an orientation which produced the next round of catastrophic defeats for the proletariat, and ultimately paved the way for the victory of fascist governments also in France and Spain. In his analysis of the 7th Congress of the Communist International, Trotsky wrote that it not only aimed at legalizing the opportunistic turn in France, where the Communist Party campaigned for the formation of a bourgeois government under Leon Blum, which was ultimately established in 1936, but sought to immediately transplant it to the rest of the world. It, quote, proclaimed that all countries in the world, such as Germany, as well as democratic Norway, Great Britain, as well as India, Greece, as well as China, are equally in need of the People's Front, and wherever possible, of a government of the People's Front. End of quote. The Congress, after a period of isolation and fumbling, marked, quote, the final entry of the Communist International into its 4th period, which has for its slogan, Power to Daladier, for its banner, Tricolor, for its hymn, the Marseillaise, crowning out the International. End of quote. This assessment did not mean that, and very correct assessment, that Trotsky simply ignored the Stalinist parties, which at the time still had a mass following in the working class. It was precisely because of the rightward turn of the Communist International that inside the communist parties and on their periphery, they are accumulating to an increasing degree contradictory tendencies, which must lead to an explosion or a series of explosions. From this, Trotsky explained, flows the duty for the organizations of the 4th International to follow most attentively the internal life of the communist parties in order to support the revolutionary proletarian tendency against the leading social patriotic faction, which will henceforth become more and more enmeshed in the attempts of class collaboration. End of quote. These issues remain of urgent relevance. Of course, unlike the social democratic and Stalinist parties of the 1930s, today's nominally left organizations lack any real base in the working class and cannot be considered workers' parties in any meaningful sense. Nonetheless, the class content and political function of the new Popular Front policies advocated by various pseudo-left organizations remain fundamentally the same. While the ruling class moves once again toward fascism and world war, the pseudo-left promotes the illusion that workers must align with the supposedly more left or democratic factions of the bourgeoisie. In doing so, they become active participants in the genocidal war drive and the counter-revolutionary offensive against the working class. And only the International Committee of the 4th International grounds its program on the historical lessons of the 1930s. As then, the fight against fascism and war today demands the independent political mobilization of the working class, unified internationally on the basis of its shared class interests, in opposition to capitalism and all its political defenders, and in the struggle for socialism. The decisive issue is political clarity and leadership. Trotsky explained that the task of the new international was not only to intervene where possible in the immediate struggles of the working class, but to do so on the basis of the defense and development of the entire theoretical and programmatic heritage of Marxism. In his open letter for the 4th International, which I quoted from earlier, Trotsky insisted, and I think this is really important and powerful and very much speaking to the situation and our tasks also today. The new parties and the new international must be built upon a new foundation. That is the key with which to solve all other tasks. The tempo and the time of the new revolutionary construction and its consummation depend, obviously, upon the general course of the class struggle, the future victories and defeats of the proletariat. Marxists, however, are not fatalists. They do not unload upon the historical process those very tasks which the historical process has posed before them. The initiative of a conscious minority, a scientific program, bold and ceaseless agitation in the name of clearly formulated aims, merciless criticism of all ambiguity. Those are some of the most important factors for the victory of the proletariat. Without a fused and steeled revolutionary party, a socialist revolution is inconceivable. The conditions are difficult. The obstacles are great. The tasks are colossal. But there's no reason whatever to become pessimistic or to lose courage. Despite all the defeats of the proletariat, the position of the class enemy remains a hopeless one. Capitalism is doomed. Only in the socialist revolution is there salvation for mankind. The very sequence of the internationals has its own internal logic, which coincides with the historic rise of the proletariat. The first international advanced the scientific program of the proletarian revolution, but it fell because it lacked a mass base. The second international dragged from the darkness, educated and mobilized millions of workers, but in the decisive hour, it found itself betrayed by the parliamentary and the trade union bureaucracy, corrupted by rising capitalism. The third international set for the first time the example of the victorious proletarian revolution, but it found itself ground between the millstones of the bureaucracy and the isolated Soviet state and the reformist bureaucracy of the West. Today, under the conditions of decisive capitalist collapse, the Fourth International, standing upon the shoulders of its predecessors, enriched by the experiences of their victories and defeats, will mobilize the toilers of the Occident and the Orient for the victorious assault upon the strongholds of world capital. End of quote. This is what the Fourth International, today only represented by the ICFI, has done since. Preserving historical continuity, developing the Marxist perspective, educating cadre, and preparing for the resurgence of the revolutionary movement. Trotsky's fight to found the Fourth International in the midst of the horrors of fascism and the mass murder by the Stalinist bureaucracy was not an act of despair. It was a declaration of confidence in the revolutionary capacity of the working class and in the necessity of preparing the leadership in advance. We carry forward the task today to educate the working class, to expose the betrayals of the past and present, and to build the leadership capable of leading the world socialist revolution. This is the central task, comrades of the school, and the intensified offensive for Trotskyism that must ultimately flow from it. Thank you.